Welcome back to NTD Good Morning. I'm Kerry Dunst. Alibaba, China's e-commerce giant, is facing serious allegations of providing tech support to the Chinese military, support that may be used in operations targeting U.S. interests. The company is also accused of sharing sensitive customer data, including IP addresses, payment records, and Wi-Fi details, with the Chinese regime. This is according to a Financial Times report that cites an internal White House memo, and this isn't a first-time event. For Alibaba, U.S. lawmakers have raised alarms, with some urging the Trump administration to take tougher action against the Alibaba group. So what does all this mean for U.S. national security and the broader tech landscape? Well, joining us to break it down is Daniel Cochrane. He's a senior research associate at the Heritage Foundation and host of China Insider David Zhang, who brings deep insights into China's tech and geopolitical strategies. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining. Daniel, starting with you, for those unfamiliar with Alibaba, it would be helpful if you could give us its scope in and outside of China, as well as highlight a little bit about these recent allegations, which are quite significant from a national security perspective.
Certainly. Well, Alibaba is one of China's largest tech companies. They provide both cloud services, so similar to Amazon here in the United States. They allow for companies and individuals to essentially host data and also engage in various compute functions via servers that they host. Now, the problem is they're also providing AI tools. They provide significant AI LLMs, and those LLMs are being utilized by the Chinese military against American interests, as the memo highlighted. This is really an interesting development because we've also seen similar things happen with American companies. So specifically, Anthropic here in the United States recently disrupted attempts by Chinese state actors to use their agentic AI Claude against high-level American targets, including financial institutions, chemical companies, even government targets. We also know that TikTok has long been collecting Americans' data, and that companies like Alibaba and TikTok have an obligation under Chinese law to participate with the CCP to target Americans and to profile us. It's a really concerning threat to our national security and our sovereignty.
Yeah, you bring up a couple great points there. And one, obviously, we saw TikTok getting transferred to U.S. ownership, but Alibaba, which about 20% of online shoppers say that they go to Alibaba, so its scale is quite significant in the U.S. And David, of course, Alibaba now has denied these accusations that they have any cooperation with the Chinese military, but in Washington, they're not so convinced. So how deeply integrated, in your understanding, is Alibaba with the Chinese state and their military capacity?
Well, Kerry, it's very interesting because for Alibaba, it's not like somebody in China just goes to their office and demands them to do certain things, but it's a very systematic a pressure and procedure to do so. So from the very beginning, the management behind Alibaba had to grow the company through the influence of the Chinese regime. So they've been sort of tied together in the very beginning. But obviously, there's also data laws and security laws in China that mandates that Chinese companies, especially tech companies, should they require their data, they have to share it with the Chinese government. But also think about what the interest of the Chinese government and its companies really have. It is a total unrestricted warfare against the United States. So financial, cyber, and tech are part of that. And so combining all of this, you really see what's essentially an agenda to compete against American companies, but also at the same time provide something called a civil-military fusion, which essentially there's no real distinctions between a civilian company or a military company. So at any given moment, a company in China could be weaponized, especially if it is like somebody like Alibaba that has so much data in its hands from consumers, but also industry leaders alike. And in those sense, you combine everything together. It's really a comprehensive system that's at play.
Yeah, you bring up some very interesting points, particularly around how when you think of warfare, you think of tanks and planes, and that's really not the modern warfare system, and especially with this unrestricted warfare where, potentially cyber attacks, these are all things that could be enabled through these fusions, as you described them. Daniel, over to you. What are the legal and then ethical risks for U.S. companies who do want to engage with Chinese tech giants like Alibaba for commercial interests?
The risks have never been higher, both from an ethical and national security standpoint. Look, especially when you're putting your data on their servers, we have this with TikTok too. All that data is stored in servers in China. It's accessible at any time by the companies or the governments. And as David mentioned, there really isn't a separation between the companies and the military. It's all integrated. Every company is a potential weapon of the Chinese Communist Party. And we know that they've been very clear. Their goal is to use the best technologies out there, specifically AI, to perpetrate attacks against American targets. That includes crippling our critical infrastructure. It includes, as an example, hacking systems like the system behind our flights here in the United States, the aircraft here in the United States, that which can really create delays and huge problems for our economy. So we got to understand this sort of the civil military fusion that David mentioned, but we also need to understand that when you put your data in an LLM or in a cloud service hosted by a Chinese company like Alibaba, you're basically just helping the Chinese military create digital profiles to surveil, censor, and control American interests. It's really a concerning development.
Yeah, and as I had alluded to earlier, probably a relief that TikTok is being transferred to U.S. servers. But as you pointed out, they have years and years of that data. But we don't have reciprocity. Obviously, Amazon can't operate inside China, but Alibaba able to do commerce here in the U.S. And David, we know that China has been aggressively pursuing AI and tech innovations. Daniel was talking about, those large language models, which really are the underpinnings of how AI functions. So does Alibaba fit into China's broader strategy to advance, this technological and military fusion that you had been describing earlier?
Yeah, so really, for the average, it's really hard to understand how data can be weaponized. And the key here isn't necessarily tomorrow they're going to come into your front door and demand certain things from you, but it is a building up through these machine learning and now essentially AI functional models that create almost like a strategic plan, assessments, or even a plan of attacks against a certain interest in the United States. For example, it could be the intelligence community. It could be your power grid or infrastructure, water lines. Anything specifically that they can do to cripple the system, to cause fear, and to demand even sort of a ransom out of those attacks, or to simply temporarily shut down certain things can be done. But also with data specifically, this is where it gets really tricky because it's almost like they know more about us than we do about them. And so in warfare, a lot of times it's really about knowing your enemies. But that's also another point where, it could be individuals as well. For example, if you're a local politician, they could formulate a plan to how to better win you over to speak on behalf of the Chinese government instead. Or maybe, it could be certain things like learning about that you have certain debts that they can reach out to help you pay off in exchange for, say, secret intelligence files or whatnot. So there's different ways that they can use data. And so for the average American, they think that, well, we don't have to care about our data being used. Well, in the age of I guess you would call this a cyber warfare or technology warfare, it's a very much of a broad scale attack and plan of collection of information that we should really be worried about. And honestly, a lot of times my fear is that the very data that they're able to be given by the average Americans are in turn used to harm other parts of America in the same way.
Yeah, you're talking about this use of this sensitive data, maybe one data piece in isolation, not that meaningful, but when there's data points that can be triangulated and then use those AI tools to then do things at scale, it can be activated and it is a vulnerability. To that point, Daniel, with Alibaba's AI capabilities, what security threats do you think it poses to the U.S. specifically?
Yeah, well, actually picking up on David's point, I think it's critical to understand. And as you said, look, with AI, you can take a bunch of seemingly disparate data points and link them together because AI is fundamentally a pattern recognition technology. It's very good at taking disparate pieces of data and then creating digital profiles, figuring out what your vulnerabilities are, whether it's at an individual level or an institutional or even at a governmental level. And finding those vulnerabilities is of high value to the Chinese. But in addition to that, and going beyond the sort of the pattern recognition and the uncovering of vulnerabilities that AI can provide and is to the Chinese, it's also giving them advanced cyber hacking capabilities. And we know this because the Chinese are using, and I mentioned Anthropic, which is an American company, and they disrupted this attempt, but it was an attempt by Chinese actors to use advanced LLM capabilities to hack basically American critical infrastructure. I believe there was something like over 30 targets. So we know that they're using the AI not just to parse data, but also to perpetrate attacks on our critical infrastructure. So it's sort of that two part challenge. But I'll add a third element, and we saw this with TikTok. And the reality is that the Chinese still control enormous amounts of our tech stack, other applications like Temu. And we know, for example, that TikTok's algorithm was designed to surface the most toxic content. That is a strategy to rend America's social fabric. So AI in that context, in the context of say, AI chatbots, could be used strategically by the Chinese to disrupt America's social fabric. That's just as effective in some way as hacking our critical infrastructure, and it's far more diffuse and harder to combat.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting point about how any division in society, anything that stokes chaos, is in line with the unrestricted warfare that David had been alluding to. But, marketers use this data to try to figure out who they should be their likely converters for, products they're selling. The platforms use this, the social media platforms, to create engagement. So, David, as we start to wrap up, I'd just like to get some understandings of different other use cases that the CCP might be trying to, mix these data sets, consumer data sets, with military objectives, with, sort of PR or publicity type objectives that serve its greater goals.
Right. And Daniel summarized it really well with those three key points. And I just wanted to add on top of that, one additional one I think worth for us to know is market caps, right? Because the more that you see Chinese products, the more that you see Chinese content, the more you see things coming out of China being in, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, the more reliance you create. When you have reliance, it's a long-term dependence on something that you really cannot get rid of. For example, with the 5G infrastructure or the 4G infrastructures in the United States, it's taking the country a very long time to replace and swap out those equipments. And those equipments, when they're in place, you rely on them for the communications, but also they provide those surveillance capabilities and potentially spying on, say, a key military base nearby. So it just shows you that once you get these things into the system, it takes a long time for them to go away. With the digital fentanyl like TikTok, that goes a step further. It's implanted into a teenager's brain for certain types of algorithm-based content that they like or desire. So it's almost like you're creating a base for relying on things coming out of China that eventually serve a very harmful long-term effect to those in America and other countries as well.
Yeah, if the term digital fentanyl doesn't set off alarm bells, then you really are asleep at the wheel. Such a fascinating and important conversation. Daniel Cochrane, David Zhang, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks.